At 5:19 on a February morning, a 28-year-old fourth-grade teacher stood alone in an alley off Frankfurt Avenue in Philadelphia, looking down at a dying man. Her name was Estella Doyle, and she had $11 to her name. In her coat pocket was a train ticket she'd saved 3 weeks to buy. Non-refundable, non-exchangeable, the 5:52 to New York. At the other end of that ride, a job was waiting for her. The kind of job that pulls a person out of a hole they've been living in for 13 years. She had 33 minutes to make it. The man on the ground probably had less. Nobody would have blamed her for walking away. That's the thing about being poor, you learn to do a certain kind of math, and everybody around you understands it. Dozens of people would pass that alley before sunrise. Not one of them stopped. So what would you have done, standing there in the cold, with your whole life sitting on a train that leaves in 33 minutes? Estella Doyle made her choice that morning, and she made it without knowing one thing, the single fact that would turn her quiet, invisible life inside out and never let it go back. Because the man she was kneeling beside wasn't a homeless stranger. He was a Mafia boss. If this story moves you, tap that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, so you don't miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to that alley, and to the 33 minutes that changed 2 lives forever. She dropped to her knees first, one knee touching the wet concrete, and the first thing she did wasn't check his pulse. She looked at the man's left wrist. The watch was still there, its crystal unscratched, its metal band heavy. The kind of watch she had never once held in her hands in all her life. She knew what it was worth. She didn't know the exact figure, but she knew it was more than 3 months of her wages, more than what she still owed her landlord, more than everything left in her bank account put together. Her fingers had gone stiff with cold, so it took her a moment to release the clasp. The band slipped from his wrist so easily that it startled her. She stood, put the watch into her coat pocket, and walked away. First step. Second step. She didn't run, because anyone running through an alley at 5 o'clock in the morning looked like someone who had just done something. Third step. Fourth step. She thought about how the Market Frankfurt train would stop running early at Girard Station tonight, because they were replacing the tracks, and how the shuttle bus wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes, which was why she had been forced to walk, why she had cut through this alley to save 4 minutes, why she had seen him at all. Fifth step. Sixth step. She thought about where she would sell it, which pawn shop she would choose, what they would ask, and what she would say. Seventh step. Eighth step. She thought that a man who wore a watch like that and ended up dumped between 2 trash cans had surely been involved in something, and things like that weren't meant for her. Ninth step. 10th step. 11th step. 12th step. Then she heard him breathe. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a groan. It was only one very short, very shallow breath drawn inward, the kind of breath made by a body counting down the last few it had left. Estella stopped in the middle of the alley. She didn't turn around. She stood there with her right hand clenched around the watch inside her coat pocket, so tightly that the edge of the clasp pressed into her palm, and she stood there longer than she thought she did. Then she turned back. She retraced those 12 steps faster than she had taken them away, and when she knelt beside him for the second time, she placed 2 fingers against his neck. There was a pulse, weak and uneven, but it was there. His skin was colder than the concrete beneath him. The left shoulder of his coat had gone stiff, dark, and congealed, and she didn't look closely at that part. She pulled out her phone. A diagonal crack had run across the screen since September, and she still hadn't had the money to replace it. She dialed 911, lifted the phone to her ear, and heard the first ring. Then his hand seized her wrist. It happened so quickly that she let out a short scream and nearly dropped the phone. His hand wasn't trembling. It closed with force and precision around the place between bone and tendon, and even though he was barely conscious, she understood at once that this was the hand of a man who knew how to keep another person from getting away. He opened his eyes, only a narrow slit. He didn't look at her. He looked at the phone. Then he spoke, his voice so hoarse it sounded like sandpaper. But every word was clear, and there wasn't a trace of pleading in any of them. Don't. Hospital. They'll find me there. Estella didn't move. The second ring sounded in her ear. His grip tightened slightly, and his next words were even shorter. Hang up. She ended the call. She didn't know why she did it. Later, many times, she would try to find a reason, and she would never find one that made any real sense. She knew only that when a dying man was still lucid enough to fear a hospital more than he feared death, There was something here she didn't understand, and if she made that call, she never would. His hand loosened and fell to the ground. He closed his eyes again. She leaned close to him. "Can you still hear me?" He didn't answer. She shook his uninjured shoulder harder than she meant to. Hey, listen to me. If you don't open your eyes in 3 seconds, I'm calling again." He opened them. Perhaps that was the most frightening thing about that entire morning, the way his eyes opened at the exact moment he was threatened, as though some piece of machinery inside him responded only to that particular kind of signal. "Can you stand?" He didn't nod or shake his head. He braced his right elbow against the ground. She slipped her shoulder beneath his arm and pulled. He was far heavier than she had expected, and for the first 2 seconds, she thought she wouldn't be able to lift him. But he pushed part of his own weight up through his legs, and then they were both standing, staggering and leaning against the brick wall. She heard his teeth strike together, and at that exact moment, from somewhere across the city, came the distant sound of a train horn. It stretched out, low and mournful, and then faded. It wasn't very far away. It was simply too far to reach. Estella Doyle didn't look up. She tightened her arm around the man leaning against her, looked toward the mouth of the alley, and began to walk. 2 blocks. That was the entire distance, and it took them nearly 20 minutes. Every 20 steps or so, he had to stop and lean against a wall or a lamppost, and she waited beside him, one arm braced across his lower back, her eyes flicking toward the end of the street. One car passed, its headlights sweeping over them before moving on. She pulled up his collar to hide more of his left shoulder. "Keep moving. Just keep moving." She said it so many times that later it became a kind of rhythm. No longer words at all. He never answered. But every time she said it, he took another step. At the final corner, she saw the door to her building and thought they had made it, and that was exactly when he collapsed. He didn't fall toward her. He fell forward, his knees striking the front step before the rest of him slid down, and she couldn't catch him in time. All she managed to do was wedge one hand beneath the back of his neck so his head wouldn't strike the concrete. He didn't wake up. She called his name, then suddenly remembered that she didn't know it. She pounded on the first-floor apartment door. "Mrs. Vogel. Mrs. Vogel." A light came on inside after about 10 seconds, and Renata Vogel opened the door with the expression of a 68-year-old woman who had been awakened at 5:40 in the morning and had been accustomed to such things 30 years earlier. She looked at Estella, then passed Estella's shoulder at the man lying face down on the steps. She didn't ask a single question. She stepped outside wearing nothing but slippers and crouched beside him. She lifted the shoulder of his coat for exactly 3 seconds, then let it fall. "Take his legs. I'll take the upper half. Straight up to the 2nd floor. Don't stop at the landing." The 2 women carried him up 2 flights of stairs. Renata was breathing hard on the final 8 steps, but she didn't stop. They laid him on Estella's living room floor because the couch was too narrow, and Renata knelt beside him, tore open the layers of clothing, pressed 2 fingers along his collarbone, then reached around behind his back. She was silent for a moment. Then she spoke in the flat, measured voice of someone reading from a statement. Bullet went through the shoulder, entered from the front, and exited through the back. Nothing lodged inside. 1 graze along the right side, shallow. 3 fingers on the left hand are broken. Broken from being bent back, not crushed. She lifted one of his eyelids, looked, then let it close. "Where did you find him?" "The alley behind Frankfurt." Renata looked up at her for the first time since opening the door. "Do you know the law in this state?" Estella shook her head. "Any hospital in Pennsylvania that receives a gunshot wound has to notify the police. It is mandatory. No exceptions, no begging, no pretending he fell onto a fence. Within an hour of him being placed on a stretcher, there will be 2 uniformed officers standing at the foot of his bed and a 3rd person asking your name, what time you found him, and what your relationship is to him." Renata wiped her hands on the hem of her nightgown. "Take him in, and you will find out who he is. Keep him here, and you never will." Estella looked down at the man lying on her floor. She thought of the hand that had seized her wrist in the alley, and the way it had tightened, precise and steady. "I am keeping him here." Renata gave one nod, neither approving nor objecting, then began issuing orders. Boiling water. "Clean towels, as many as you have. Your table lamp, take off the shade, and open the kitchen window all the way. I don't want this man dying from lack of air while I am stitching him up." She worked for about 40 minutes. Estella stood beside her holding the lamp. and through all 40 minutes, she heard only 3 kinds of sound. The scissors, the man's ragged breathing whenever Renata touched something deep, and Renata's own voice, clipped and sharp. Hold the light lower. Keep still. Don't shake. Twice, his body arched upward. Both times, Renata simply pressed one hand against his chest and waited. When it was over, she stood very slowly. One hand braced against her knee, then dropped heavily into the chair. She looked at what she had just done with little satisfaction. Listen to me. I can keep him from dying tonight. I can't keep him from getting an infection over the next 5 days. Bullets aren't clean, and alleys are even worse. And I have nothing here but alcohol and sutures. Estella asked what they were supposed to do. Renata reached for the flip phone in her pocket and dialed a number, staring at each key for a long moment before pressing it. She spoke for about 2 minutes. She didn't greet the person, didn't make small talk. She only named 3 medications, gave the dosages, and said one sentence that sounded human. I know I am asking you to do something that could cost you your job, and you have every right to say no. She listened to the person on the other end, then she snapped the phone shut. His shift ends at 7 o'clock. The medicine will be outside the door at 7:30. There will be no one's name on it, and you are never to ask me who he is. Estella nodded. Renata rose to leave, then stopped at the door. Oh, that stack of insurance papers from this month. She spoke without turning around. Come downstairs and read them to me when you have time. They sent more of them again, and my eyes can't manage the small print anymore. Estella said yes, she would come down. The door closed. The only sound left in the apartment was the breathing of the man lying on the floor, slow, steady, and still there. He opened his eyes on the afternoon of the second day, and for the first 15 seconds, he didn't look at her even once. He studied the ceiling to determine which floor he was on. He studied the window to determine direction. He turned his head very slowly, in pain, but he turned it all the same, and his eyes stopped at 3 places in a precise order: the front door and the lock on it, the narrow space between the dining table and the wall where one person could hide, and finally the steel pipe wedged beneath the broken leg of the bookcase, the only thing in the room that could be picked up and used as a weapon. Only then did he look at her. Estella was sitting in the chair across from him, more than 6 feet away, exactly the distance chosen by someone who wanted to keep watch, but didn't want to be within reach. He looked at her the way a man studied a number on a price sheet. What do you want? Those were the first words he had spoken to her since the alley. Not where am I, not how long has it been, not a word of thanks. What do you want? Estella didn't answer at once. She stood, walked to the kitchen table drawer, took out the watch, and placed it on the tabletop between them, the crystal facing upward. The sound of metal touching wood was sharp in the silent room. I took this. When you were lying on the ground, I removed it from your wrist, put it in my pocket, and walked away. I made it 12 steps. Then I came back. She returned to her chair. I am telling you because I don't want you to find out some other way. He didn't look at the watch. He looked at her face, and he looked for so long that she lowered her eyes, then forced herself to raise them again. In 19 years, many people had sat across from him and lied, and he had learned to recognize every kind. The lie told out of fear, the lie told out of greed, the lie told because another lie had already come before it. But no one, not one person, had ever carried a crime to him that he would never have discovered if they had simply kept silent. The watch was sitting there. If she hadn't told him, he would have assumed the others had taken it. That was exactly what he had believed for the past 2 days. The silence lasted long enough for Estella to feel its weight pressing against her chest. At last, he asked, "What is your name?" "Estella. Estella Doyle." He gave one very slight nod. She waited. She waited for the thing anyone else would have done next. He closed his eyes and said nothing more. She remained there for a while, then understood that he wasn't going to tell her his name. Not today, perhaps not ever. And that his silence wasn't because he had forgotten it. That evening, Mrs. Vogel came upstairs to examine the stitches again and said they needed more gauze, the large kind, and rubbing alcohol. Estella put on her coat and walked down the street. The corner store was open all night, the only place in the neighborhood still open at that hour. The owner sat behind the counter as he always did, and she placed the gauze and the bottle of alcohol on the glass while he entered the prices into the register. Then she looked down. His phone was lying face up beside the cash tray, the screen still lit, and there was a photograph on it. It showed a man stepping out of a car, taken without his knowledge, slightly blurred around the edges, but the face was clear. She had been looking at that face on the floor of her apartment for 2 days. Beneath the photograph was a short line of text and a phone number. Beside that number was another figure, 50,000. Estella didn't raise her eyes too quickly. She kept looking for one more beat, exactly as long as an ordinary person might accidentally glance at someone else's phone. Then she looked up and handed over the money. The owner gave her the change. He placed the items in a paper bag. Then he asked, in the same casual tone one might use to speak about the weather, "You have company at your place these days?" Estella said no. "I am buying these for Mrs. Vogel downstairs. She fell on the stairs last week." He nodded and said, "Yeah, the stairs in these old buildings are dangerous." She took the paper bag and walked toward the door. It took 4 steps. She didn't turn around, but she saw her reflection in the glass, and behind it, the owner was still standing motionless behind the counter, not picking up his phone, not doing anything at all, only watching her back until the bell above the door gave a single chime and the door closed behind her. She went home, set the paper bag on the table, and didn't say a single word about the photograph on the store owner's phone screen. She didn't mention it that night. She didn't mention it the next morning either. She told herself she was keeping quiet because he was still too weak, but that was only half the reason, and she knew exactly what the other half was. The next morning, he managed to sit up with his back against the wall, and he watched her cleaning the kitchen for a long while before he spoke. "Do you have a pen?" She handed him a ballpoint pen and a scrap of paper torn from the notebook she used for grading. He took the pen in his right hand, lowered it to the paper, then stopped. He stared at the page for about 2 seconds before pushing both things back toward her. "Never mind. Just listen. Give me a name and an account number. Any bank will do, as long as it is in the United States. 1 week from now, you will have $500,000. Estella stood still, the dish towel held in her hands. "You are lying on my floor, and you don't even have a pair of shoes." He showed no reaction to that. "My money isn't kept in my wallet. It is somewhere else, and that place continues to function no matter where I happen to be lying. 1 phone call, 1 week, $500,000. You can pay off everything you owe on this apartment, leave this neighborhood, and never have to think about me again." He said the last sentence like a term in an agreement, not an attempt to comfort her. Estella folded the towel, hung it on its hook, then turned toward him. "No." He waited. He was clearly expecting her to name a different amount. "I didn't save you so I could sell you." A silence followed, and within that silence she saw something on his face that she couldn't interpret. It wasn't gratitude. It was closer to irritation, the expression of a man who had arrived at the wrong answer in a calculation and was going back through every step to find the error. "You want more?" "No." "You want something else?" "No." He tilted his head slightly. "Everyone wants something, Miss Doyle. I am not saying that is wrong. I am only saying I need to know what it is before I know how to behave with you. I want you not to die on my floor. Beyond that, I haven't thought about it yet." He studied her a little longer, then rested his head against the wall and breathed out. The calculation still wouldn't balance. Then she pulled out the chair, sat across from him, and spoke in the same voice she used in her classroom when she needed a child to understand that this time she meant every word. "If you are staying here, there are 3 conditions." He said nothing, which meant she should continue. "First, there will be no guns in this apartment. I don't care how you get one or where you hide it. If I see a gun, you go out that door the same day, even if you still can't walk." He didn't promise. He didn't argue either. "Second, you don't lie to me. You have the right not to answer. If you don't answer, I won't ask again. But once you open your mouth, what you say has to be true. I can live with not knowing. I can't live with being deceived inside my own home." He looked at her for a very long time after that, longer than he had after the condition about the gun. "And the third condition?" Estella pointed toward the sink, where 4 bowls and 2 pots had been sitting since the day before. "Once you can walk again, you wash your own dishes." Another silence followed, shorter than the one before it. Then he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It rose from deep in his chest, brief and hoarse, and immediately pulled at the wound in his shoulder, forcing him to tip his head back and close his eyes, and she saw his jaw tighten while the sound was still fading. When he opened his eyes again, he said, "I agree to the third one, and the other 2, you have to answer clearly. I won't bring a gun into this apartment." He paused for one beat. "And I won't lie to you, but you should understand that there are many things I won't tell you." "I understand." He nodded. That evening, she changed the gauze on his shoulder, and while she was cutting the bandage, he asked whether there was anything unusual outside, his voice as casual as if he were asking the time. Estella finished cutting the strip, set the scissors down, and said there was nothing. It was the first time she lied to him, and the instant the words left her mouth, she realized that the second rule had only ever been meant for one of them. There were many things he wouldn't say, and one of them had happened 3 years earlier, in a room on the south side of the city, on a Tuesday afternoon. The man sitting across from him that day was 63 years old. His name was Walter Nash, and he entered with his hat held in both hands. His shop sold used books. It had been open since 1982. Its name was Nash and Daughter, and he had borrowed money to keep it alive through 4 straight years without a profit. He was 4 payments behind. He stood in front of the desk and explained. His wife had undergone heart surgery in November, a procedure to replace 2 valves, and the insurance had covered only part of it, and he had poured everything he had into paying the rest. He wasn't asking for the debt to be forgiven. He was only asking for 60 more days. Exactly 60 days, because March was when the schools nearby bought their books, and he would be able to find the money then. Calvin didn't look up. He was reading another file, something completely unrelated, and he continued turning the pages while Walter Nash spoke. When the man finished, the room remained silent for about 3 seconds. Then Calvin spoke, his voice neither high nor low, with nothing in it at all. "This family isn't a church." He pushed a sheet of paper across the desk toward him. "Sign here, and the debt is settled." Walter Nash picked up the paper. He read it very slowly. Then he set it down and asked one question, only one, whether there was any other way. Calvin turned to the next page in the file before him. "Whether you sign or not, the result will be the same. Signing is faster." Walter Nash signed. The store closed within 9 days. His wife died 11 months later. Calvin learned about it one morning, through a line in a report no longer than 20 words, and he skimmed it before moving on to the next item, because that week there were 3 larger matters requiring his decision. He didn't remember the man's name again until 3 years later. That Thursday morning, Estella stood before 31 children and 19 books. Fairhill School was a charter school, housed in an old building in Kensington, and in her classroom, every 3 children had to share 2 books. It was Miles Harper's turn to read aloud. He was 9 years old, seated at the second desk from the back, and he stood with the book already open in his hands. He read the first 3 words. Then he stopped at the 4th. He stared at it, tried one sound, got it wrong, tried again, and got it wrong once more. A giggle came from the row on the left, then another, then an entire corner of the classroom. Miles's face turned red, and he dropped back into his seat before she had time to say anything. Estella didn't call out the names of the children who had laughed. She didn't lecture the class about how cruel it was to laugh at someone, because she had done that twice already that year, and both times it had only led to Miles being teased more in the schoolyard after dismissal. She simply said, "Thank you, Miles," called on the next child, and let the lesson continue. When the bell rang and the children poured out, she asked him to stay. She sat in the chair beside him, at eye level, rather than standing over him. She took the book, placed her finger beneath the line, and told him to try again because no one else was there. Miles tried 3 times before he read it correctly. He didn't smile. He only stared at the word for a very long time, as though he wanted to make certain it would still remain there the next time he came back to it. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the principal called every teacher down to the boardroom. She spoke briefly. The state charter board had voted not to renew the school's license, citing academic performance and several financial concerns, and the school would close in June, at the end of the academic year. Every teacher there was employed under an at-will contract, so there would be no renewals, no severance pay, and their health insurance would end on June 30th. Someone asked about the insurance. The principal said anyone who wished to keep it could continue paying for it out of pocket. Estella didn't ask anything, because she already knew what her number was. The insurance the school bought for them carried a $6,000 deductible, which meant that for the past 2 years she had paid her premium faithfully every month and had never once been able to use it. She walked home. She stopped at the bakery and bought the 2 cheapest loaves of bread, then climbed the stairs, opened the door, and hung her coat on the hook. He was sitting against the wall in the same place as before. She said, "I bought bread. We will make do with that for dinner tonight." and she said it in exactly the same voice she used every other day. He didn't respond to that. He watched her hang up her coat, watched her set the bag of bread on the table, watched her hands. Then he said, "What happened today?" Estella turned around. Nothing happened. He didn't ask a second time, but he didn't look away either, and she stood there holding 2 loaves of bread. And she understood that her own second rule had just been broken for the second time in 3 days, and this time, both people in the room knew it. That evening, she sat cross-legged on the floor grading papers, with the tin box beside her, its lid open. He watched it for a while before asking, "What is in that box?" Estella set down her pen. "Cards. On the first day of class every year, I give each child a blank white card and tell them to write down one thing they want to become. Then I collect them. I keep every one. I have kept them since my first year of teaching." She tilted the box so he could see inside. One said firefighter. One said auto mechanic. One said ice cream seller, written 4 years ago, and the child who wrote it was in 7th grade now. He asked why she kept them. She shrugged. "I am not really sure. At first, I was only copying someone else." She reached to the very bottom of the box and pulled out a card. "This one is mine. I wrote it when I was 9. On the last day of school, my 4th grade teacher gave them back to everyone in the class. My mother put mine in a drawer without telling me. I found it when I was packing my things at 22. I had been teaching for 3 weeks by then." He looked at the card in her hand, but didn't ask what was written on it, and she didn't tell him. She placed it back in the box. Then she took out a blank card and handed it to him with the pen. "You write one." He didn't take it. "I am 37 years old. Then write what you wanted to become when you were 9. That will do." Silence followed. Then he reached out with his right hand and took the card and pen. He placed the card on the hard cover of the notebook she gave him. He held the pen, and he didn't write. Estella saw his hand trembling. Not much, only the way the tip of his thumb pressed harder against the barrel than it needed to, and the way his whole hand lifted and lowered once before the pen touched the paper. She knew it wasn't because of his wound, because the injury was in his left shoulder, and he was holding the pen in his right hand, the same hand that had gripped her wrist 2 days earlier hard enough to leave marks the following morning. He wrote. He wrote very slowly, even more slowly than Miles Harper had that morning. He wrote 4 words. Then he looked down at what he had written, and he stared at it longer than it had taken him to write it. Estella leaned closer. The 4 words slanted slightly below the line, the letters large and rigid, and 2 of the 4 words were misspelled, not from haste, but in the way letters are reversed or placed in the wrong order. He folded the card in half, then crushed it inside his palm. "Give me another one." Estella held out her hand. She wasn't offering him a new card. Her open palm was asking for the old one back. He didn't give it to her. "Give it to me." He did. She opened it across her lap and smoothed it flat with the edge of her hand. Once, twice, 3 times, until the fold was nothing more than a faint line. Then she placed it inside the tin box. "I told you to give me another one." "No." He looked at her. It was the same look he had used on the people sitting across from him for 19 years, and it had worked on most of them. Estella closed the lid of the box. "The first one is always crooked. I have a whole box filled with crooked first attempts. If you hide the first one day you will hide the last one too." He said nothing. She picked up her pen and continued grading. She finished 2.5 papers, and she truly graded them. She wasn't pretending, and perhaps it was precisely because she no longer looked at him that he finally spoke. "The letters don't stay still." Estella stopped writing but didn't look up. "On the page. They don't stay where they are the way they do for you. I look at one line and they slide. They aren't blurry. I can see every one of them clearly, but they trade places with each other. By the time I reach the end of the line, the beginning has changed. I have to go back and read it again, and when I do, it changes again." He paused. "When I was a child, I thought everyone saw it that way. I thought other people had to read everything 4 times too, only they were faster than I was. One day in 7th grade, a teacher made me stand and read aloud in front of the class. I stood there for about a minute. They didn't laugh loudly. They only laughed under their breath." He looked up at the ceiling. "I left school when I was 14. My father said the boy wasn't suited for school and should be put to work. I thought he said it to spare me the humiliation. Later, I understood that he meant it. He truly believed it. He was silent for a long while. That was 23 years ago. In all those 23 years, there has never been a page I read by myself. Someone has always read it for me. I pay extremely well for that. I let them read, I listen, and I remember everything. I never forget a number, and I sign wherever they point. Estella didn't say a word. She didn't tell him it was all right. She didn't tell him he was gifted in other ways. She sat silently on the floor with the stack of half-graded papers in her lap, and she allowed the silence to remain there, and only after a long while did she manage to say one thing, very softly. A child in my class stopped in exactly the same way this morning. He didn't ask the boy's name, but he turned his head toward the tin box on the floor, and he looked at it for a very long time. The following afternoon, Renata came upstairs carrying the stack of insurance papers bound with a rubber band. She set it on the table and dropped heavily into the chair. They sent 4 more pages. I think they are asking for money, but they may be giving money back. I can't make sense of it. Estella was standing at the sink with both hands covered in soap suds, one shoulder holding the phone against her ear while she waited for someone from the school's human resources office to answer. "Give me 5 minutes, Mrs. Vogel." Renata waved one hand. "No hurry. I can sit here until I die." Then Calvin's right hand reached out and pulled the stack of papers toward him. He removed the rubber band. Estella turned to look at him, and she was about to say something, but she didn't. He lifted the first page, laid it flat on the table, and began to read aloud. "Notice of benefits. This is not a bill." He stopped. He looked down. "This is not a bill." Renata said nothing. She sat there with both hands resting in her lap, her eyes on the paper rather than on his face. He continued, "For services provided on January 14th, amount requested for pay." He stopped a second time. "Meant, payment, $342. Amount paid by the plan, $298. Amount you may owe." He stopped for the third time, the longest pause of all. $44. He finished the first page. Then he read the second. By the 4th page, his voice stumbled a little less, and he even read the line of fine print at the bottom that no one ever read, the one stating that she had 60 days to file an appeal. Renata nodded. "So that is 44 plus 21 plus 21. $86. All right, I can pay that." She wrapped the rubber band around the papers again, stood, and before leaving, she said, "Thank you." Exactly 2 words, in the same voice she used when thanking the woman at the butcher counter. She said nothing else. After she left, the room remained silent for a long time. Estella was still standing at the sink, and the water had gone cold. He looked at the bundle of papers, no longer on the table. "All my life, I have made other people kneel." She didn't turn around. "It turns out I was only hiding the same thing a 9-year-old child is hiding." That evening, he managed to make it out to the back steps on his own, where the iron fire escape overlooked the trash-filled yard shared by the entire row of buildings. He sat on the top step. After a while, she brought out 2 cups of tea and sat on the step below him, about an arm's length away. They remained silent for quite some time. Then she asked, "How many people have you killed?" She asked directly, without softening it, without lowering her voice, in exactly the way she would ask a child whether he had taken something. He didn't turn toward her. He didn't ask why she wanted to know. "You made a rule that I wasn't allowed to lie to you." "Yes." "Then I will answer according to that rule." He set his cup of tea on the iron step. "There are people I did myself. There are people for whom I only said one sentence, and someone else did it. In those 23 years, I have never sat down and counted, because what would counting change? But if you are asking whether there is a number, I won't lie and tell you there isn't one." He paused. "Enough that you shouldn't be sitting this close to me." Estella didn't stand. She didn't move farther away. She held the cup of tea in both hands and looked down into the yard below, and she remained exactly where she was. She didn't say she wasn't afraid of him, because she was. She didn't say she trusted him not to hurt her, because she wasn't certain. She simply sat there. He turned and looked at her. "Did you hear what I said?" "Yes." "Do you understand what I just told you?" "Yes." He watched her a little longer, then looked down at her hand resting on the iron step between them. He lifted his right hand. He extended it slowly, and his fingertips stopped about 2 knuckles from the back of her hand. He held them there long enough for both of them to see the distance. Then he drew his hand back and placed it on his knee. He said nothing about it, Neither did she. After a while, he said it was late, braced one hand against the step, and rose more slowly than usual, before going inside ahead of her. Estella remained alone on the iron steps until the tea in her hands had gone completely cold, sitting there with two things she told no one: the photograph on the phone screen at the corner store, and the distance of 2 knuckles that had just existed between them. The owner of the corner store had picked up the phone 3 times in 4 days. The first time, he entered the entire number, then ended the call before it could ring. The second time, he sat staring at the screen for about 10 minutes before turning it face down. He wasn't a bad man. He owned a store that stayed open all night in a neighborhood where insurance companies refused to offer coverage. He had a daughter in her 2nd year at community college, and he was 2 months behind on his mortgage. He also knew how to make the calculation every poor person knew how to make. The third time, on Saturday afternoon, after seeing the teacher from the 2nd floor pass the store again without coming inside, he dialed the number, and this time, he didn't hang up. He said only 3 sentences. He gave the address, said 2nd floor, and said the old woman downstairs was a nurse. Then he ended the call and stood behind the counter until his shift was over, and afterward he wouldn't sleep properly for months. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Estella woke because someone had placed a hand over her mouth. It was Calvin. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding one finger up with his other hand. In the darkness, she could see only the shape of him. Then she heard it. Footsteps on the stairs. More than one person. They weren't the ordinary footsteps of anyone who lived in the building, because the people who lived there always stepped on the 9th stair that creaked, and no one ever bothered to avoid it. These footsteps avoided the 9th stair. He removed his hand from her mouth and said in a breath, "Go down to Mrs. Vogel. Go." The door. He didn't finish the sentence. Someone knocked. 3 times, even and unhurried, like someone familiar. Then silence. Then the door broke inward. Estella didn't have time to scream. She heard wood splitting, hinges tearing free, and at the same moment another sound came from the fire escape, the kitchen window being forced upward. Someone had already been waiting outside. It was completely dark. She could only listen. The sound of someone striking the dining table, the sound of a chair falling, a man's body hitting the floor with terrible weight, followed by a dragging sound. Someone cursed once, briefly. A beam of light swept across the ceiling and vanished. Then a voice she had never heard before spoke from the darkness, sharp and calm, only 2 words. "Cal, move." A hand seized Estella by the wrist and pulled her to her feet, and she knew immediately whose hand it was because it tightened around the exact place between bone and tendon, just as it had that morning in the alley. He pulled her toward the kitchen window. She yanked herself back. He didn't ask why. She rushed 3 steps toward the table, felt through the darkness, found the tin box, pressed it against her chest, then turned back. When she reached the iron stairs, a man was waiting there, holding the window open, and Estella had time to see only that he was tall, his hair cut close, about 40 years old, and breathing like someone who had just run 2 blocks. "Go down first," he said, then pushed her by the shoulder toward the stairs. On the 1st floor, Renata was already standing at the back door with a coat pulled over her nightclothes, a cloth bag held in her arms, and she didn't ask a single question. Estella would learn later that the man had knocked on Renata's door 2 minutes earlier. They ran across the backyard, over the low chain-link fence, into the alley behind the building, where a car was waiting with its doors open. Estella climbed in last. She sat in the back seat between Renata and the door, the tin box held tightly in her lap. The car had gone about 1 block when she turned to look behind them. At first, there was only a faint orange glow in the 2nd floor window. Her window, dim and almost beautiful. Then it grew very quickly. By the time they reached the end of the block, smoke was rising above the roof, and she heard fire engines approaching from the opposite direction. Stella didn't make a sound. She didn't cry. She only sat with her head turned toward the rear window until the car made a turn, and that glowing window disappeared completely. Everything she owned in the world had been inside that apartment. The unfinished papers belonging to 31 children, her only winter coat hanging on the hook, 2 photographs of her parents in plastic frames, a box of her mother's papers kept inside the closet, though in truth, she had moved that box into a rented storage unit the year before because the apartment was too small, and that was the only thing that had gone in her favor that night, though it would take several more days before she understood just how important it was. No one in the car spoke for about 5 minutes. Then the driver spoke without turning around. I have been looking for you for 3 weeks. I followed that phone number, not you, because I knew someone would call sooner or later. This afternoon, a call came from this neighborhood. I got here half a step before they did. Only half a step. He paused. They aren't dead. I don't do that inside a home where people live. Calvin was sitting in the front passenger seat, one hand pressed against his left shoulder, and he said the other man's name for the first time. Elias. Then he turned and looked back at Estella, at the way both her arms were wrapped around the tin box, as though she were holding a child, and he looked at that box for a very long time before turning his face away. The car traveled for more than an hour, out of the city and northward, before stopping in front of a house at the end of an unlit road in Bucks County. A woman was already waiting on the porch with the door open. She was 46 years old, dressed in a sweater and slacks, and looked as though she had been working all night. She looked Calvin over from head to foot, pausing at his left shoulder and his bandaged hand, and the first thing she said was, 19 days. He answered, 19 days. She turned to Estella and Renata, gave one nod, then said, the room on the left and the room at the end of the hall. There are clothes in the closets, and don't use your own phones, not even to check the time. The following morning, she spread the documents across the dining table. She offered no introduction. She simply laid each file down in order, the way someone might deal cards. Estella sat at the head of the table because Calvin told her to sit there, and no one objected. Renata leaned against the kitchen cabinet with a cup of coffee. Elias stood in the doorway. Margot placed the first file on the table. This is the record of a federal trial from 2015. We lost 3 people in this case. I always thought it was bad luck. She placed down the second file. This is the case from 2018. We lost 4 people and a warehouse in Chester. Bad luck again. The third file, 2022. We lost 2 people in the northeastern part of the city, and both of them were competing with Vincent for the route. She set down the fourth file, noticeably thinner than the others, and turned it toward Calvin. And this is something I obtained last week from someone whose name I won't give you. It is a list of recorded meetings between an informant and the federal office for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The informant isn't named, only identified by a code number. That code number first appeared 14 years ago. She placed one finger on a column, the dates of the meetings. Then she placed her finger on the papers beside it, the dates of the arrests. After every meeting, an arrest followed between 2 and 5 weeks later, 11 times in 14 years. The timing was never wrong. No one in the room said anything. Margot pulled out another sheet, and this is the list of everyone arrested in those 11 cases. I sat down and read through the entire list 3 times. Not one of them belonged to Vincent. Not one. Every name was either one of his rivals or someone at the very bottom, the kind of person who could be replaced within 2 weeks. Every time we lost someone, Vincent moved up another step, and we never suspected him because he was always the one who cried the loudest at the funeral. Elias shifted slightly in the doorway, then became still again. Calvin didn't move. He didn't pick up a single page. He didn't strike the table, ask her to repeat herself, or tell Margot to read any part again. He simply sat with both hands resting on the tabletop, staring down at that column of dates as though it were something he had known for a long time, but had never been willing to name. Estella saw his jaw move once, very slightly. That was all. Margot placed the final file on the table. This one is from this week. Part of the operating rights to dock number 7 has been transferred to a company registered in Delaware. That company was established 5 months ago. The name on the papers belongs to a lawyer in Trenton, but the money came from Arthur Kessler. She looked up. Which means he didn't only take your chair. He also sold the thing you had just finished signing for that night. Renata set her coffee cup on the table with a small click in the silent room. Without looking at anyone in particular, she said that she could step outside if anyone needed her to, and Margot told her to remain seated. Then Margot folded her arms. Now comes the part I have to ask you, because the people on the other side are waiting for me to bring back an answer. There are still 9 people standing with you. Those 9 people have waited 19 days without hearing a single word from you. They don't care what this pile of paper proves. They asked me only one question, and I am repeating it exactly as they asked it. She paused. Do you want to handle this the way your father would have, or some other way? No one drew a deep breath in the silence that followed. Elias looked down at the floor. Margot didn't repeat the question or press him for an answer. Estella sat at the head of the table with both hands resting in her lap, and when she looked toward him, she realized that this was the first time since the alley that she had seen him refuse to answer a direct question. He didn't say he didn't know. He didn't say he needed time to think. He stood, bracing his right hand against the tabletop to push himself upright, walked out through the back door, and sat in a wooden chair overlooking the lawn. He remained there until noon. Margot gathered the papers, arranged them in exactly the same order as before, tied them together, and told Estella in an ordinary voice that she should eat something. Then she carried the files into the back room. Only one thing remained on the dining table: the column of dates that no one had thought to put away. On the third day in Bucks County, Margot asked Estella whether she had any belongings stored anywhere else. She said she had a rented storage unit on Aramingo Street, the smallest size available, and that she had been paying $41 a month for it since the previous year, when her apartment had become too cramped. Margot wrote down the unit number, and by that afternoon, 2 cardboard boxes had been placed on the living room floor. Estella opened the first box after nightfall. It contained her mother's belongings. She hadn't opened it since the day she moved it into storage. There were several sets of clothes she hadn't been able to give away, a notebook filled with recipes, and 3 letters from the church. At the very bottom was a brown cardboard document folder tied with string, thicker than she remembered. She opened it on the floor. The first thing inside was a clipping from the local newspaper, the paper yellowed with age. The date in the upper corner was 13 years earlier. It was only a brief article, fewer than 200 words. A 47-year-old electrician had died after falling from scaffolding at a construction site at Packer Marine Terminal during the night shift. The victim was Thomas Doyle. Authorities had determined that it was a workplace accident. Estella had read that article before. She had read it when she was 15, and she remembered every word, and she couldn't understand why her mother had kept it all those years when reading it brought nothing but pain. She turned to the next page. It was a copy of the project records. On the first page, under the section identifying the terminal developer, one name appeared in capital letters: Castellano Holdings. She read the line. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still. She remained motionless for so long that when she finally moved, her legs had gone numb. She turned another page. The third document was a letter from a law office downtown, dated 4 months after the accident. It was addressed to Mrs. Doyle. The letter stated that the firm had reviewed the matter and regretted that it couldn't accept the case, because the official investigation had concluded that the death was accidental, and there was no basis for bringing a civil claim against the developer. Below that, in the middle of the page, one sentence had been underlined 3 times in blue ballpoint ink, with such force that the final stroke had torn through the paper. No witnesses were recorded, although 6 people had been working the night shift. Estella placed the letter on the floor. She stared at that sentence underlined 3 times and thought of her mother, sitting at some kitchen table on some evening 13 years earlier with a ballpoint pen in her hand, and she realized that her mother had known. Her mother had known all those years and had never said a word to her, and now there was no one left to ask why. She continued turning the pages. There were 4 more letters, all from different law offices, all refusing the case, the last dated 2 years after the first. After that, there were no more letters from lawyers in the folder. The next document was something entirely different. It was a stack of hospital records spanning over a decade, and on top was a final notice from a collection agency addressed to Estella Doyle, demanding the accumulated debt from her mother's long illness. The letter stated that under Pennsylvania law concerning a child's financial responsibility for a parent, an adult child could be held liable for a parent's unpaid medical expenses. The remaining balance was $81,240. The letter instructed her to contact them within 30 days. She had contacted them. She had called 3 times, and each time she had been transferred twice before someone read a prepared statement to her. On the 3rd call, she had asked whether she could make payments, and the person on the other end had asked how much she earned, and after hearing the figure had fallen silent for a moment before saying, "We will make a note of that." She hadn't called again. Estella returned everything to the folder in its original order, tied the string around it, and placed it in her lap. She sat on the living room floor of a house in Bucks County that belonged to someone she didn't know, with the folder resting across her knees, and she didn't cry, and she didn't stand, and she remained that way for a very long time. In the next room, light from a table lamp shone through the partially open door. Calvin was sitting there alone. In front of him was a stack of blank paper Margot had left the day before, and he was holding a pen. He wasn't writing anything long. He was writing his name. He wrote it, looked at it, crossed it out, then wrote it again on the line below. He had been doing that for nearly an hour. The entire page was filled with the same name, written once on every line, and the final 3 lines had begun to sit straighter than the ones above them. He didn't know she was sitting in the other room. She didn't know he was practicing how to write. Between them stood a thin wall and a door left slightly open, and that night, neither of them crossed through it. At 4 o'clock in the morning, she still hadn't slept. She went downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water, and on the way, she opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet in the hallway, the drawer Elias had opened and searched the previous afternoon before closing it again. There was a gun inside. She picked it up. She had never held a gun before. It was heavier than she had imagined, and cold, and she held it in both hands, as though it were something that might break. He was standing in the kitchen with his back to the door, filling a glass from the faucet. He heard her footsteps and turned around. He saw her. He saw the gun. He set the glass down on the kitchen counter very slowly, and said nothing. Estella raised it. Her hands were trembling so badly that the barrel moved in circles through the air. "Do you know what I lost that morning?" He didn't answer. "I had a seat on that train. It was the last train of my life. Do you understand? Not the last one that day. The last one of my life. I left it behind in that alley to drag you home, so a 70-year-old woman downstairs could stitch you back together at 6 o'clock in the morning, so I could lose my home too." She swallowed. "And now I find out that I gave up all of that to save a man who carries the name of the family that killed my father." He didn't ask what she was talking about. That frightened her more than anything else. He didn't ask her to repeat a single word. He only looked at her, then took one step toward her. She stepped back. "Stay where you are." He took a second step. "I said stay where you are." He took a third step, then a fourth, and he kept walking until the barrel touched the front of his shirt and stopped against his chest. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't push the gun away. He stood there with both arms hanging at his sides. "If you shoot me, I won't blame you. I mean that. I am not saying it because it sounds noble. You are holding that gun exactly where it belongs." She couldn't speak, but before you pull the trigger, let me find out who gave the order. He said it very slowly. "Not so I can be forgiven. I am not asking for that. So you will know the right person. Because if you shoot me tonight, and I am not the man who did it, then the man who is will sleep peacefully until he dies of old age, and you will be the one who goes to prison for him." Estella stood there for several more seconds. Then her hands lowered. The gun slipped from her grasp and struck the tile floor with a dry, hard sound. And she cried. She cried the way someone cries after not allowing herself to do it for a very long time. At first, there was no sound, only her breath breaking apart in uneven pieces before everything finally gave way, and she sank onto the kitchen floor and wrapped her arms around her knees. The last time she had cried was 2 years earlier in a hospital corridor, and afterward she had believed there was nothing left inside her. He didn't come closer. He bent down, picked up the gun with his right hand, removed the magazine, placed both pieces on the kitchen counter far away from her, then sat on the floor across the kitchen, with his back against the cabinet, and he remained there until she stopped. 3 days later, Margot returned from the city, and she didn't place the file on the dining table as she had before. She handed it directly to Calvin in the back room and closed the door, and they remained inside for nearly 2 hours. The internal ledger from Salvatore's time recorded work shifts and expenses, and within it was an entry bearing a date everyone now remembered. The night shift at Packer Marine that evening had been supervised by a capo. The capo was 39 years old, and his name was Vincent Rossi. The electrician had discovered an unrecorded shipment and called the customs tip line at 9 o'clock that evening. The call was entered into the ledger because someone inside customs had reported it back to them. 2 hours later, the accident occurred. 13 years earlier, Calvin had been 24 years old. He had been overseeing a warehouse in Chester and had never set foot inside Packer Marine. But 3 days after the incident, Salvatore Castellano entered an expense into the ledger with 3 lines of notes, and those 3 lines showed that he had known. He knew who had done it, knew why, and did nothing, because Vincent controlled the entire port route at the time and couldn't be replaced. That afternoon, Calvin carried the file out to Estella. He didn't summarize it. He didn't say that Mrs. Keene had discovered this or that. He pulled out a chair, sat across from her, opened the file, and began reading aloud. He started with the first line. He read the title, the page numbers, even the dry passages that meant nothing. This time, he didn't stop only 3 times as he had when reading the insurance papers. This time, he stumbled over nearly every line, because the writing in the ledger was in slanted ink, and there were words he had to attempt 2 or 3 times before he could understand them. And once he read a name incorrectly and corrected himself. He didn't skip a single line. He even read the 3 notes written by his father, more slowly than everything else. When he finished, he closed the file and placed it on the table in front of her. Everything I have was built on the place where your father fell. He looked down at his hands. I didn't know. But not knowing doesn't make it clean. The following morning, she folded the clothes Margot had given her into the cloth bag, placed her mother's document folder inside, then set the tin box on top. She went down to the kitchen and told Margot that she needed to return to the city. Margot didn't ask why. She only said, I will have someone drive you, and don't go back to your old neighborhood. And if anyone asks, say you are staying with a colleague. Estella said yes. Renata sat at the dining table with a cup of coffee and watched her for a while before telling her to be careful, and she said nothing more, because she wasn't the kind of person who said more. He was standing by the front door when she went out to the car. She stopped in front of him. She had thought about this sentence all night, and she still hadn't found a shorter one. I don't hate you. He said nothing. You weren't there. I know that. I read the ledger. I know you were 24 years old and in Chester at the time. I am not a fool. She tightened her grip on the cloth bag strap, but I can't look at you without seeing my father. He didn't ask when she would come back. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't remind her that there was still a $50,000 price hanging over his head, and perhaps over hers as well. He only nodded once, exactly once, and stepped back half a pace to let her pass. He remained in the doorway until the car had backed all the way down the dirt road, turned, and driven away. He stood there a little longer after the 2 red taillights disappeared beyond the trees, and then he went back inside. Fairhill School had 7 weeks left before the end of the academic year. Estella asked the security guard to let her arrive early and leave late, and she lied that the plumbing in her home was being repaired. She slept on the couch in the teacher's lounge, the one covered in blue fabric that everyone knew sagged in the middle, and she woke before 6 o'clock each morning to fold the blanket and put it away in the cabinet before anyone arrived. She taught every class on her schedule. She graded papers. She kept Miles Harper for an extra 15 minutes each day and told no one about it. One afternoon, the boy asked why she had been staying at school so much lately, and she told him it was because she liked being there, and he nodded as though that were a perfectly ordinary answer. In Bucks County, Calvin didn't leave the back room. Elias brought back a total of 11 boxes of records from 3 different locations. 20 years of books, belonging to an organization where everything had been recorded by hand, because no one dared place it on a computer. He sat with them from morning until late at night. He read with agonizing slowness. Some pages took him half an hour. He placed a ruler beneath each line and moved it downward as he read, and when Margot saw him doing that, she bought him a box of highlighters in 4 colors without saying a word. For the first time in 23 years, he knew what was written in his own records without having to listen to someone else read them aloud. On the 3rd day, he called Margot into the room and showed her 4 expenses, recorded in 4 different years, the same kind of payment, written in the same way, and told her to compare them with the column of dates from the other day. Margot compared them. She sat down in the chair and spoke one sentence very softly. 3 days passed that way. 2 people in 2 different places, and neither called the other. She didn't have his number. He knew where she was, but he didn't go to her, and he didn't ask Elias to pass by the school and check on her, though one evening he nearly said the words before stopping himself. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Estella was sitting at the last table in the teacher's lounge, finishing the final stack of papers, when she realized one small thing. Today was Thursday. Every Thursday, Renata walked to the church on the corner to collect canned food distributed to elderly residents, and she had done so for 9 years, even when it snowed. Estella wondered who had been taking her there these past few days. At that same moment, in Bucks County, Margot Keene's phone vibrated on the dining table. She answered. She listened for fewer than 10 seconds, then stood. Calvin looked up. Margot lowered the phone. Renata hadn't returned home since the previous afternoon. The second call came at 9 o'clock that night, to Margot's phone, from a number no one recognized. Vincent spoke briefly, his voice calm, and he didn't make a single threat because he didn't need to. He said the old woman was well. He said she was 68 years old and had a mild heart condition, so he didn't want to keep her for long either. He said he wanted the 11 boxes, all of them, not one book missing, and he knew there were exactly 11 because he had counted them through another source. He gave them 2 days. Then he said the final sentence, and that sentence was the real reason he had called. Cal, you have exactly 3 people left. The woman lawyer, the driver, and the teacher. I just took someone you didn't even count on the list. Estella heard the news at 10 o'clock that night. A car picked her up at the rear gate of Fair Hill School, and an hour and a half later, she walked into the house in Bucks County with the cloth bag over her shoulder. Calvin was standing in the kitchen. He saw her and said nothing. She set the bag on the floor. Don't misunderstand. He still said nothing. I didn't come back for you. She looked directly into his eyes. I came back because I am still the person who turns back. Margot spread a map of the Port District across the dining table at 11 o'clock, and they remained around that table until nearly 2 in the morning. Elias spoke first, because he was the man who spoke the least, and when he did speak, everyone listened. I know where he sleeps. I know what time he leaves, which route he takes, and how many men go with him. One night, 3 of my men, and by tomorrow morning this will be over. That is how our side has always done things, and we have always done it that way because it works. Margot pushed the file toward the center of the table. And I say this. You have 11 boxes of records. He needs them more than he needs the old woman. I take 2 boxes to him, keep the other 9 as insurance, and tell him that if anything happens to her, those 9 boxes will be sitting on a prosecutor's desk within 2 hours. He releases her. You keep what you need to keep. No one dies. Calvin remained silent for a long time after they had both finished. Then he asked Margot an entirely different question. The person in the federal office for the Eastern District, the one who has been holding Vincent's file for 14 years, do you know the name? Margot looked up. She studied him for a moment, then said, Ruth Calloway, 49 years old. She has been in charge of the Northeast investigation since 2019. Calvin nodded. Call her. The entire room went still. Elias rose from his chair, then sat back down. Margot placed her pen on the table. Do you understand what you just said? Yes. No, you don't. Your name appears in those 11 boxes about 700 times. I know. I read them. He said it as though it were nothing unusual. Over the past 3 days, I read all of it myself. I didn't listen to anyone else read it. I know what is in there. Ruth Calloway arrived the following afternoon, driving alone, parking out on the road, and walking to the house. She brought no one with her. Calvin placed 1 box on the dining table, opened the lid, and pushed it toward her. There are 10 more in the garage. Not 1 book is missing. Not 1 page has been torn out, and I haven't removed or separated any part of it. Calloway leafed through several ledgers. She moved quickly, like someone who knew exactly what she was looking for, and when she reached the 4th book, she stopped for longer. She closed it and looked up. What do you want? She asked in the voice of someone who had heard the answer to that question about 300 times. I am not asking for witness protection. I am not changing my name, moving to another state, or doing any of that. I stay here, and I answer for my part. Calloway placed both hands on the table. Then what do you want? Calvin pushed a thin file toward her, the one Margot had copied from the internal ledger, together with the yellowed newspaper clipping and the lawyer's letter containing the sentence underlined 3 times. 13 years ago, an electrician died at Packer Marine Terminal. The record says it was an accident. It wasn't an accident. I am not making any demands. I am only asking one thing of you. Put this on the desk where it belongs, and let someone read it with the eyes of a person who still believes it matters. Calloway picked up the file. She looked at the sentence underlined 3 times. Then she looked at Estella, who sat silently at the head of the table, and she was the only person in the room that day who understood immediately who Estella was, without needing to ask. I can't promise you anything. I don't have the authority to make that promise to anyone. She placed the file inside her briefcase. I can only promise that I will put it there. Then she took out a sheet of paper, turned it around, and pushed the pen toward him. You understand that you are signing your own arrest warrant, don't you? Calvin took the pen. He read the paper from beginning to end, slowly, including the small print at the bottom, and no one in the room hurried him. I understand. he signed. "This is the first time in my life I have signed something I was able to read all the way through myself." At 11 o'clock at night, the container yard at dock number 7 was a maze of steel, 4 stories high, and at its center lay an open space about the size of a basketball court where the forklifts usually turned around. Calvin walked into that clearing alone. He carried a portable metal safe, the kind that held exactly 4 ledgers, and he set it on the concrete in front of him before stepping back half a pace. He wasn't carrying a gun. Vincent approached from the opposite side with 6 men, and 4 of those 6 belonged to Arthur Kessler, standing in a loose line behind him. He stopped about 33 feet from the safe. He looked around once, scanning the tops of the containers and both entrances, before finally lowering his eyes to the safe. 11 boxes. I said 11 boxes. That holds 4 books. Where is the old woman? Vincent tilted his head toward the rear. A car was parked about 100 feet away with the interior light on, and through the window, the shadow of someone could be seen sitting in the back seat. She is alive, awake too. She has been cursing at the driver all afternoon. Vincent stepped forward. Cal, I know you didn't come here to give me 4 ledgers. You came because you think you can finally do tonight what you have been thinking about for 19 days. You came alone because you want to do it with your own hands. I understand you. I stood beside you for 9 years. Calvin didn't answer immediately. He looked at the man across from him, the man who had taught him how to read a room when he was 20, the man who had stood beside his father's coffin and truly wept, the man who had poured his final glass of whiskey. Do you remember what you taught me? Vincent remained silent. You told me that in this business, the man whose hand trembles is the man who loses. You told me that exactly 9 times. The last time was last year, in the car on the way back from Chester. Calvin stood straight with both arms resting at his sides. I came here so you would know one thing. I am not trembling. My hand is as steady as it was the day you taught me. He paused for 1 beat. I simply don't want it anymore. Vincent frowned. He didn't understand at first. That was what Calvin would remember for the rest of his life. That for those 2 seconds, Vincent Rossi genuinely didn't understand what those words meant, because nowhere in his entire vocabulary was there room to hold them. Then he understood, and he turned his head toward the men behind him at the exact second the lights came on. Not one light, all of them at once, from the tops of 4 rows of containers, from both ends of the entrances, and from places where no one had imagined men had been lying in wait for 2 hours. The entire yard flooded with white light. A voice came through a loudspeaker, brief and repeating the same command, and footsteps thundered across the steel. Kessler's 4 men ran about 50 feet before dropping to the ground. Vincent's 2 men knelt where they stood, with their hands behind their heads, like men who had done this before. Not a single shot was fired. Calvin didn't move. He remained exactly where he was, both hands raised level with his shoulders, watching Vincent being forced face down onto the concrete about 33 feet away. Vincent didn't resist. He let his cheek press against the ground and turned his head toward Calvin, and he watched him the entire time the handcuffs were being secured around his wrists, and he didn't say a word. 2 people opened the doors of the car parked in the distance. Renata Vogel stepped out on her own feet. She pushed away the hand of the person trying to support her and said she could walk by herself, then added that 30 hours without blood pressure medication was no laughing matter, then asked whether anyone there had any water, and she was still complaining about how cramped the back seat had been as she walked toward the ambulance. Ruth Calloway approached Calvin. She wasn't in a hurry. 2 agents followed behind her, and one of them carried handcuffs. She stopped in front of him. You can still change your mind. Right now. Calvin shook his head. He lowered his hands, placed them behind his back, and did it slowly, without drama, like a man hanging his coat on a hook. The sound of the cuffs closing was very small in that vast yard. Calloway read him his rights. He listened to every word, and at the end, she asked whether he understood the rights she had just read to him, and he said yes. Beyond the chain-link fence at the edge of the yard, about 130 feet away, Estella stood beside Margot and Elias. She had been standing there since before the lights came on. She didn't call his name. She didn't clutch the fence, run along it, or do anything that would have looked like a scene from a movie. She simply stood with both hands in the pockets of the coat Margot had lent her, and she watched. They led him through the beam of light cast by a vehicle parked across the entrance. At that exact place, he turned his head. He looked toward the fence. The light stood between them, so perhaps he couldn't see her face clearly, only the outline of someone standing there. But he knew it was her. He nodded once, the same single nod he had given her in the doorway of the house in Bucks County. Estella nodded back. Then they placed him in the vehicle, the door closed, and it drove toward the port gates. 3 weeks later, Ruth Calloway arranged to meet Estella at a coffee shop rather than in her office, and that was the first detail that made Estella understand the meeting would never appear in any official record. Calloway placed a thin file on the table and kept one hand resting on it for a moment before sliding it across. "I am not authorized to show you this. I am showing it to you anyway, and you are not to photograph it, and if anyone asks, you have never seen it." Estella opened the file. The first page was a copy of a form suspending the investigation, dated exactly 5 months after the accident at Packer Marine. One box had been checked under the reason for suspension, and it stated that continuing the investigation could jeopardize an ongoing federal operation. Beneath it was the signature of someone whose name had been blacked out, along with a handwritten note. "The key witness in this matter is currently serving as a cooperating source. Agreement signed 13 months ago." Estella turned to the next page. It contained a list of source identification numbers, and one of them had been circled in pencil. Beside it, in the margin, someone had written a name by hand, Vincent Rossi. She sat motionless. She looked at the name, then at the date the agreement had been signed, and then she did the subtraction anyone could do. He had made his agreement with them first. A year later, he killed her father. And when the police began asking questions, someone sitting behind a desk somewhere had read the file, understood the problem, and closed it, not to protect Vincent, but to protect the stream of information he was providing. She thought about the 6 people working the night shift that evening, none of whom had ever been entered into the record. She thought about her mother writing to 5 law offices over 2 years and receiving 5 letters of refusal, and how her mother had never known that those letters could never have produced any other result, because the door had been locked from a place she could never reach. Estella didn't scream. She didn't strike the table. She closed the file, pushed it back toward Calloway, and asked only one question. "In those 13 years, did anyone ever call my mother and say they were sorry?" Calloway opened her mouth. Then she closed it. She looked down at her coffee and remained that way for quite a while, and at last she said she didn't know, but she believed no one had. It was the most honest answer Estella had received from a government agency in 13 years. That same week, Margot Keene called Estella into her office and told her to bring the brown document folder. Margot read everything from beginning to end, including the fine print on the back that Estella had never thought to turn over and examine. Then she set down her pen. "This law is real. It can require children to pay their parents' medical bills, and this state is one of the few that actually enforces it. But the court has to consider the adult child's ability to pay." She tapped one finger against Estella's pay statement. "You earn $41,000 a year. You have just lost your job. You have no home. You own no property. And you contacted them voluntarily 3 times to ask for a payment plan. I am taking this case without charging you. You keep teaching. I will handle the rest." The hearing lasted 20 minutes, and Estella had to answer only 3 questions. The judge denied the collection claim. On the way out, Margot handed her a copy of the ruling and explained each paragraph slowly, pointing to every line with the tip of her pen. Estella held the paper and realized that in all 28 years of her life, this was the first time anyone had sat down and read documents to her without charging for it. She told no one. 3 days before the federal trial, Calvin asked permission to visit one place, and Calloway agreed on the condition that 2 people accompany him and remain 10 steps away. It was a used bookstore on the south side of the city, its front windows boarded up for 3 years, though the wooden sign above them was still intact. The former owner lived in the apartment directly upstairs. Walter Nash opened the door and recognized Calvin after about 2 seconds. He said nothing. He began closing the door. Calvin placed a document and a ring of keys on the front step. "The store belongs to you. The papers have already been signed. There are no conditions." Walter Nash stopped moving. Calvin didn't climb the steps. He remained below them and spoke, saying the words he had practiced for 3 nights. "You asked me for 60 days so you could care for your wife. I said no. She died 11 months later." He paused for 1 beat. "No contract is worth more than being able to sit beside your wife for 60 more days. I am not asking you to forgive me. I only want you to know that I finally understood that. Too late, but I understood it." Walter Nash stood in the doorway for a long time. He looked at the document on the step, then at the ring of keys beside it. He descended one step, bent down, and picked up both. He still didn't say a word. Then he straightened and held out his hand. The trial took place at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania on a Tuesday morning. The courtroom wasn't crowded. Margot Keene stood, opened her briefcase, and began the familiar sentence, saying that on behalf of her client, she requested permission to read his final statement. She had done this exact thing for that family for 20 years. Calvin raised his hand. "Let me." She stopped in the middle of the sentence, looked at him, then sat down. He took a sheet of paper folded into quarters from his coat pocket. He opened it, smoothed it flat on the table, and looked at it for a moment before beginning. He read the first half of the opening line. Then he moved to the second line and stopped. He hadn't made a mistake. He simply stopped, his eyes still fixed on the page, his throat moving once. The entire courtroom was silent. The judge didn't prompt him. The clerk stopped typing. No one hurried him. And that silence lasted about 15 seconds, long enough for someone in the back row to lower his head. Then Calvin placed one finger at the beginning of the line and continued reading. He read slowly and steadily, and he read every word. "I spent 20 years making other people feel small. I didn't do it because I was strong. I did it because I was afraid someone would discover that I couldn't read a page. I took a store away from a man whose wife was lying in a hospital. I sat upon an inheritance I believed I had built, only to learn that part of it stood on the place where an electrician had fallen. I didn't know that, but I never tried to find out, and my failure to look is my crime." He stopped and turned the page. "Almost 3 years ago, a schoolteacher missed the last train of her life to pick me up from an alley. She didn't ask who I was. She only asked whether I could stand on my own. Your Honor, I am not asking for a lighter sentence. I am only asking to say these words in my own voice, because this is the first time in my life that I have been able to do so." The sentence was 32 months in federal prison, along with the forfeiture of all his assets. As 2 officers escorted him past the benches, he stopped for exactly 1 second and said only one thing to her. "The box. Keep my card in it." Fairhill School closed that June and never opened again, but the old bookstore on the south side of the city did reopen. It no longer sold books. Hand-painted across the front window were the words, "Doyle Reading Room, free, all ages." Estella taught there every afternoon from 3 o'clock until 6. Walter Nash made coffee and repaired the tables and chairs. Renata Vogel watched the door and scolded the children for making too much noise, and the children loved being scolded by her. Miles Harper finished reading the first complete book of his life in the 9th month, and that day he read the final passage aloud to the entire room, and no one laughed. The wall behind the counter gradually disappeared beneath paper cards. Every month, a letter arrived from Fort Dix. The first contained only 4 lines, the handwriting unsteady, with 3 mistakes. The final one was 2 pages long, and the lines had become straight. One February morning, Estella stood outside the prison gates. He walked out alone, empty-handed, with no car waiting and nothing left in the world bearing his name. She took from her coat pocket the watch she had kept for nearly 3 years and had never once tried to sell, took hold of his wrist, and fastened it around him. "I am returning what I took." He looked down at his wrist. "You took something far more valuable, and I don't want it back." That afternoon at the reading room, 11-year-old Miles Harper ran over and showed Calvin a card he had just finished writing. The letters leaned in every direction. 2 words were misspelled, and 1 had been crossed out. The boy lowered his head and said, "My writing is terrible. Can I have another card and start over?" Calvin took the card, smoothed it flat with the edge of his hand, then pinned it to the wall. "Leave it exactly as it is. Everyone needs a crooked first attempt, so they can remember later that no one is born already knowing how." Then he took out a blank card and handed it to the boy. "Save this one. When you know what you want to become, write it down." The boy took the card and ran off to show his friends. Beyond the front window, a train passed at the end of the street, the sound of its steel wheels stretching out and slowly fading. Estella heard it, and she didn't turn around. This story leaves us with 3 lessons. The first is that there are some trains we are meant to miss, because boarding them would cost us who we are, and when a person loses themselves, it no longer matters where they arrive. The second is that a person's value isn't measured by how many words they can read, how much money they can earn, or how high they stand, but by whether they have the courage to admit what they don't know. Many people spend their entire lives living in fear because of a weakness that might have been healed if only one patient person had sat down beside them. And the third is that kindness can't erase the past or bring back those who have been lost. But it is the only thing that can decide whether tomorrow will be different. Treat others with respect, even when they have fallen low, because no one knows who the person they reach for today may become tomorrow. And more importantly, because the act of reaching out reveals who they themselves are. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to the channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories each day. How did this story make you feel? And have you ever faced a moment when you had to choose between your own interests and turning back to help a stranger? Please leave a comment so we can hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always have abundant health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.